Good morning, and glad to see everybody could make it on this nice early morning. We'll go ahead and call the meeting to order. Today we'll hear updates from the project team about the Forward Drive project. Before we get started, I'm going to hand it over to Irene for her to roll call and a quick reminder about Zoom since we're all freshly new to Zoom.
Thank you so much. So just a reminder to mute yourself when you're not talking. That button is in your lower left corner. If you need help, just you can throw a note in the chat. Era Swanson will be around to help you if you run into any technical difficulties. Also, remember that you can use reactions, raise your hand, all that good stuff to get our attention. Or just use the chat and we'll be paying attention to that to make sure that your voice is heard. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and do our roll call. All right. We've got Nicole Grant.
Present.
Kelly Fukai. Senator Elias. Okay. Senator King. Senator Fortunato. Representative Phi. Representative Ramos.
Ramos is here.
Okay, Representative Barkus. Representative Orcutt.
Good morning, Ed Orcutt, State Representative, 20th District.
Good to see you. Judy Cliburn. Jason Richter. Kurt Augustine. David Burnett. Chris Herman. Tom Hinkson.
Tom Hinkson's present.
Thank you. Josh Brown. Bo Perschbacher.
Here, sorry, yes.
Thank you. Jane Wall.
I'm here.
Mayor Polly. Sharon Nelson. Janet Ray.
Janet Ray is here.
All right. Tom Walrath. Neil Straggy. Doug Vaughn.
Morning.
Hi. Bryce Yaden. Did I miss anyone?
Judy
Yeah,
Judy Cliburn.
Great.
Neil Struggy from the Washington Roundtable just joined.
Oh, awesome. Perfect. All right, that's it for me. Gonna hand it back over to you, Roy.
Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and look at the agenda for today. We're gonna talk about the RUC simulation and follow-on experience, the final results, mock standards, committee results. We're gonna take a short break, hopefully 15 minutes. We're gonna have Forward Drive project final report, the national user fee, trends update, and preparing legislation. Gonna have an open discussion of RUC issues, and we're gonna take a quick poll. Now I'm gonna go ahead and hand it off to Monica, who will share the results about the mock standards committee. Monica?
Here, I think actually I am gonna go first, if that's all
Okay.
right. We're gonna start this morning. Good morning, everybody. With kicking off the meeting with the results from the RUC simulation and follow-on experiences. And so what we're gonna do is start with the Forward Drive overview real quick. Thank you, Irie. So Forward Drive began in 2020 with research categorized into 4 categories. Financial analysis, which where we analyze the funding impacts of transportation trends, including electrification, autonomous driving, and car sharing and remote work. The next was equity, which assessed potential disparate impacts of RUC on disadvantaged populations. User experience, which researched emerging methods of mileage reporting, including vehicle telematics and odometer verification. And then cost reduction, which identified cost reduction approaches in collaboration with other states and the private sector. So the key research findings from each of these tasks were used to design a pilot to test solutions to concerns and issues in RUC. The pilot and a deeper dive follow-on experiences enabled Washington drivers to provide feedback on how well these concerns and issues were addressed. So we are now in the final phase of the project, developing the final report that summarizes all of the findings. We'll be presenting the analysis of the pilot and follow-on experiences, the final report conclusions drawn from the research, and at the end of the meeting, we'll work through the key policy questions that must be addressed in the roadmap of strategies for transitioning towards a RUC. So let's see, we'll move to the next slide. So going back to the pilot, the main objectives were to incorporate equity through prototype design and program features, measurably reduce cost in terms of scalability, cost, and performance, and validate that the choices that were offered through the design and research recommendations truly provided an improved user experience. So some of the key features of the pilot included a simple annual self-declaration of odometer reading, the option to submit an odometer photo for proof and automated reporting as an option, which we had been talking about for several months and presented on earlier. Streamlined gas tax credits that are shown clearly and transparently as part of the RUC ode calculations were available. An option to select a standard out-of-state mileage deduction, manual exemption for higher number out-of-state miles that required regular submission of paperwork and proof, and automated exemptions using location-based mileage reporting technology. And then basic one-time RUC payment and the option for installment payments throughout the year for those that may want smaller, more frequent payments. So we'll be discussing those in a little bit more detail, but those were some of the new features of the pilot that was conducted for Forward Drive. So the recruitment of the pilot, as many of you may remember, began in October of 2022, and drivers were invited to try out the simulation online in November of 2022 through February of 23. And as part of going through the simulation online, eligible candidates for the follow-on experiences were very naturally identified based on their payment preferences that they expressed, eligibility for telematics based on their vehicle type, and whether they were interested in exempting miles. So in order to receive the incentive for completing the simulation, participants had to give us feedback by completing a post-simulation survey that provided rich data on whether the pilot objectives were met, how they were filled. And then in 2023, participants that were eligible and expressed interest in the follow-ons were invited to participate in one of the 3 slightly lengthier, multi-month long follow-on experiences that allowed them to experience and provide feedback on monthly installment plans for RUC, FlexPay, using telematics to report their mileage automatically each month. That's the autopilot follow-on. And then claiming exemptions for out-of-state miles called Miles Exempt. So as participants went through the simulator, data was collected on their progress, the choices that they made throughout, where they dropped off, and what choices they made. So 1,145 participants completed the survey. And just like most of you did during the demo of the simulator, most people completed the simulator very quickly, under 5.5 minutes. And then that was better than we even expected. And then the average RUC owed based on the data entered by the user was $29.64. The participants were then asked for their feedback in that survey I mentioned earlier. And this new streamlined RUC experience resulted in 70% satisfaction rate. It was very simple. 85% of respondents said no steps were difficult to complete, and also very convenient. 56% of respondents reported taking less than 5 minutes to complete the simulation. All right, with that kind of high-level overview, I'm going to hand the presentation over to Julia to share more details of the exciting findings from the simulation surveys.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you, Jingjing. And so let's talk a little bit about our key takeaways from the simulation, pilot, and survey. And if you wouldn't mind moving on to the next slide. Oh, great. I've got slide control. I love it. All right. So for some of you, portions of this presentation will be a recap of some information you've heard already. And other portions of what I cover today will include some new content. So we found 4 primary takeaways from this research, which I'm going to discuss in depth in the coming slides, but I'll do an overview here first. So first, most of our pilot and survey participants supported a transition to RUC. Second, when asked about their preferences for reporting their mileage for a RUC program, most participants opted to self-report. Third, when offered the option to pay in a single lump sum or in installments, and we refer to this option as flexible payments, most participants opted to pay in a lump sum. However, of those who opted for installments, a significantly greater proportion had lower household incomes, which indicates that flexible payments may be an important option to support equity in a RUC program. Fourth, and this is a new takeaway that we've added since our last presentation to you on this topic, most participants wanted the option to exempt out-of-state and off-road miles, but few actually say that they drive enough miles to need more than the standard exemption. So like I said, we'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. So we'll start with our first takeaway, that most supported a transition to RUC. So about 56% of our simulation participants supported this transition, which was the highest measured support among a representative statewide sample since before we began any pilot testing. We did find that some groups supported RUC at higher rates than others. So respondents who live in Western Washington, in urban areas, and people with higher incomes were generally more supportive of RUC than their counterparts in Eastern Washington, rural areas, or counterparts with lower incomes. We also found that support for RUC varied across political affiliations. So people who identified as independent or undecided supported transitioning to RUC at a relatively high rate of 74%, Democrats at a rate of 68%, and Republicans at 30%. For the participants who indicated that they opposed transitioning to RUC, many expressed concerns that RUC would add another tax, or expressed concerns about the logistics or fairness of a potential RUC program. We also found that half of participants, about 54%, reported that they would have data security concerns with the RUC program, ranging from privacy to hacking, data breaches, and the security of their banking and location information as well. So our second finding is that most respondents, and this is a really high percentage of 88% of them, opted to self-report their mileage. We know that a few factors led to this. So first, we found that about 2/3 of respondents selected this option because it didn't require them to use a device or app. 2 in 5 respondents said that they chose self-reporting due to the cost, as the simulation portrayed this as the least costly option. And relatedly, we found that a very small proportion of respondents were willing to pay more than a few dollars per month for advanced reporting methods, such as installing a device. Last, we also found that many respondents had some concerns with some of the reporting options other than self-reporting. So 2/3 reported that they would be sorry, lost my train of thought here. 2/3 reported that they would have data or security concerns with any of those technology-based reporting options. So self-reporting, of course, raises a question about accurate reporting. So most respondents, about 86%, say that they would accurately report their miles driven. But even though many people are saying they would report accurately, most respondents actually had a pretty low level of trust that others would accurately report their miles driven. We did find, however, that participants' level of trust in others did increase a bit when the survey presented a scenario in which drivers would be required to submit an odometer photo with their self-reporting. We also found that most respondents, or 85%, opted to pay their RUC bill in one lump sum rather than in installments. However, this really varied by income, as you can see on the sort of upper right of this slide. For our participants with the lowest income bracket, so these are folks with household incomes of less than $50,000, 1/3 opted to pay in installments, compared to anywhere between 1 in 10 and 1 in 8 for respondents in all of the income brackets above $50,000 per year. So despite this relatively low uptake of flexible payment options, nearly all respondents, or 91%, reported that the option to pay in installments is important for others, and more than half, or 56%, reported that the option was important for themselves. So that said, when asked about their willingness to pay for flexible options, there was a little bit less interest. So 42% of respondents were unwilling to pay anything, 34% were willing to pay about $1, and 25% were willing to pay between $2 and $5 for these flexible options. We also asked participants to explain why they selected their payment option. And of the respondents who opted to pay in installments, slightly more than half, or 55%, reported that they could not afford their entire payment at once, while slightly less than half, or 45%, reported that they simply had a preference to spread out their payments. We found that higher rates of respondents within that lowest income bracket of below 50,000, as well as rural respondents, reported an inability to pay at once compared to those respondents with higher incomes or urban respondents. So finally, we found that most participants, about 72%, believe in the importance of claiming exemptions for out-of-state and off-road miles. We found a positive correlation between a respondent's household income and their support for exemptions. So that is that respondents with higher incomes are more likely to support exemptions. While nearly 3/4 of respondents think that exemptions are important, just over 1/2 say they would actually use automated reporting or manually supply evidence in order to claim more than the standard exemption of 200 miles. Interestingly, this proportion is nearly 3 times the only 20% of respondents who say that they actually drove more than 200 exempt miles in the prior year. So we found that participants with lower incomes and participants living in the interior of the state generally were reported driving fewer exempt miles than their counterparts with higher incomes or those who lived in border counties. So across these findings on this slide, what we're generally seeing is that that 200-mile standard exemption would work for about 80% of participants based off of the self-reported mileage. But we do know that many participants would at least want the option to claim more miles. And with that, I think I'm going to pass it on to Stephen to talk a little bit more about the simulation and follow-ons.
Yeah, for sure. Good morning. So I'm going to talk through each of the 3 follow-ons. So it's quite an information dense presentation section I have for you. So please stop me if there's questions along the way so that we can answer any questions. but we're gonna discuss each of the three follow-ons, starting with FlexPay, then Miles Exempt, and then AutoPay. Starting with FlexPay, and I want to give a high-level overview of the presentation format. We've started by identifying the research objectives that we identified early on while we were designing the experiments and the follow-ons themselves. Keeping in mind that we wanted to emphasize those three main project goals that Jingjing shared earlier: the user experience, equity, and cost effectiveness. So what you'll see through these slides is first the objectives, and then we'll talk about how the research speaks of each of the project goals. But FlexPay was, of course, testing the viability of actually splitting payments and then seeing what participants, how they felt about the experience itself. Overall, we've talked about this before, but the way that the program actually worked was we supplied the money for people to pay their RUC bill. So we actually sent them, once they enrolled, we sent them a gift card, and then they were responsible for making their payment using the gift card or any payment method that they chose to when the bill was owed. And so you'll see a theme throughout this slide. That was actually about the hardest part of the FlexPay experience for participants, was getting access to those gift cards occasionally. And it generated the most amount of sort of help desk requests. So for FlexPay, you can see we had 28 total participants, and I want to put this in context. These were were drawn from our organically recruited participants. There were 492 completed surveys in that pool. As Jingjing said, each participant for each of these follow-ons was allowed to provide their natural response to these questions. And if they chose the response that would opt them into this program, they were given another prompt to actually say that they were interested in doing the follow-on work. So for FlexPay, we had 86% of people, or 86 people, or 17% of respondents actually choose FlexPay. And then some of those people indicated that they didn't want to do additional research with us. And then when we did launch the pilot, a few more dropped. So that's how we end up at the 28 number that we actually had participate, which is a good sample size. And you can see this research focuses on the user experience and equity outcomes during that 4-month period. So first, we'll start with user experience. On the left-hand panel on all these slides, you can see sort of the key research questions. We wanted to give you insight into our frame of mind as we were designing the research itself. The user experience, most people found that payments were straightforward, 70%. We did send people a reminder or an invoice that their bill is due, and then we would send up to 2 reminders, and then we would indicate to them that they were late, and then we would stop sending reminders. So very much how utility bills or other services work if you set up payment reminders. We found that about 60% of people would pay their bill on time without any prompting. 30% relied on the reminders to make their payments. And then about 10% each month wouldn't make their payment. And so we find this to be a very effective part of the program design overall, is that automated reminder system, so that you can increase compliance with little cost to the state. And then the bottom bullet, as I mentioned, the participants that had the most trouble, it was with getting access to the money itself. So it wouldn't be a true problem in a real program. Speaking from an equity perspective, we'll reiterate the numbers that Julia was just presenting, that lower income persons under $50,000 per year were the highest to opt into FlexPay overall. And they opted in about twice the rate of the general population at 32%. Another question we asked during equity, because we were trying to understand how people decide if they want to opt into FlexPay, was that we asked them how much their RUC bill would need to be in order for them to feel like FlexPay was an option that they would need. And most participants indicated the average was about $100. And on earlier slides, you could see that overall in the pilot, most people owed about $30. So we are seeing that the highest RUC owed, or very high RUC owed compared to the average, would facilitate people wanting the flex pay. And so that could be a way to design a program in the future, is maybe you would set a level where you wouldn't offer flex pay to people who had very low bills, but you would try to build a system for people who needed the support because of income or ability to pay, or because of a larger bill. We looked at cost effectiveness. The thing I want to emphasize here is we did have 38 inquiries from 13 participants over the full length of the experiment. So we estimated that we spent about 16 hours with help desk support. That's only averages 4 hours each month. So the amount of support that was required was minimal for our 28 participants. And like I said, a lot of the questions were actually about their payment card or their payment, how they could get into the system. So in a real system, we think that this is a pretty cost-effective program to run, except for the last column here, which is who pays for the service. Like if you're going to provide a program, would you expect the user, or would you ask the user to pay a small fee for the convenience of the program? And so we did ask early on, and all participants, how they felt about paying for the program, and only 23% were willing to spend more than $1 a month before the flex pay follow-on was completed. And I should say this green box is the participants that actually were in our flex pay experiment. This is the answer they gave us actually in the original simulation survey. After they had gone through the flex pay, we asked them the question again at the very end, and we said, how much would you be willing to pay? And actually 50% were willing to pay more than $1. So I think the participants in the program saw a lot of value from the flex pay experience, and their willingness to help subsidize the program went up. Next, we will talk about miles exempt. So this is the idea that miles traveled on private roads or out of state could be exempt. This experiment was focused only on the manual mileage claiming process. So we wanted to explore how we could design a program where participants would submit receipts or other documents and evidence to the state that would prove that they had driven exempt miles during 3 months of testing. And so we developed some test tools and procedures to facilitate the process. And then our goal at the end was to see what sort of information we received, how reliable we felt the information was, and how much effort it actually took to organize. And we tested some auditing just to understand how much effort it would be on the state side were this program to be implemented. So for this test, we had 76 active participants. So this was our largest pool of the 3 follow-ons. And they participated over a 3-month period. We did focus some of the original recruitment on making sure that we were trying to reach individuals who lived near the borders, because we felt like to properly fill up this follow-on test, we would need to make sure we had those residents who might be most likely to leave the state the most frequently. And so you can see the southwest corner of the state down in Vancouver area has a good number of participants, and Spokane over on the east and then up in the border with Canada. So, but this gives you an idea of where those participants were coming from. You will see that overall 33% of the total respondents in the original simulation, so 161 people actually indicated that they were interested in the miles exempt program. So that's a very high interest rate that we identified. But keeping in mind that we did target people who we felt like would have a propensity for choosing that answer. And so you can see in our other research, lower general population response rates. First, we'll talk about user experience. People really liked the process, strange enough. They felt like it was easy to understand. They didn't have any concerns about submitting evidence, and very few actually reached out to help desk for support. So overall, the participant response was very positive. So next we move into equity. One of the comments that, yeah, go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, before you leave the,
Yeah.
so what are examples that you used of showing evidence of mileage outside of state?
It's a good question. We left it very broad. We did not want to tell people that they had to provide us a specific receipt. And instead, you can see actually a shadow behind the screen of the mileage log that we used. We gave them a sample sort of Excel worksheet that they could use if they chose to, and a lot did choose to use the platform. And they could, however they wanted, they could log their trips. If they made purchases out of state, say they bought gas or restaurants or hotels or whatever other purchases they might have made while they were out of state, they would submit that evidence to us. There were occasions, of course, where somebody would leave the state and they wouldn't make any purchases. And so we would allow them to log that trip, and then there just wouldn't be any associated evidence with it. So it's a very broad sort of spectrum.
Okay, thank you.
Of course. Did I have another question?
No, you answered it.
Okay, good. I kept talking long enough. So from an equity perspective, one of the findings that Julia also highlighted is people are not so confident that others are going to be truthful. And so that's a big part of a miles exempt program, since this is completely manual. And so we wanted to highlight sort of equity and through that lens, which is if I'm going to participate in a RUC program, I need it to be fair for myself and for others. So I want to make sure that the program is designed so that it's not easy for people to cheat the system. And so that was a common theme that we saw throughout the miles exempt process. And so we're highlighting here that fairness is most important in a program design. And there's different ways to do that, of course, but some sort of auditing process where the state is systematically taking a look at the evidence that people are submitting could be an effective way to make sure that all people in the program feel like it's being held up. You can see actually that 60% doubt that others would report accurately. So this is a big hurdle for a program if it were to be implemented. So we'll talk about how an auditing process affects cost effectiveness, because this becomes the most costly part perhaps of a miles exempt program is setting up a system to accept the evidence and then to make sure that the evidence is valid. So we did want to highlight that even among our participants, the 70 some that we had, not everybody submitted a claim every month. So some people didn't travel out of the state or on private roads, or they just chose not to report because it was maybe they only traveled very brief period and they just didn't feel it was worth their time. So 65% of participants didn't claim anything in a typical month. 25% did and provided what we measured to be sufficient documentation, and 10% provided incomplete documentation. So this is a pretty big number if you expand that out to the state as a whole. You could end up with a significant number of participants that might not be submitting evidence that's easy for the state to verify. So there's a level of effort there that may be required. We did do a 2-stage auditing process, starting first with a cursory review. So we looked at everybody, just for this experiment, we looked at everybody's documents to make sure that to be able to decide if it looked like they were providing sufficient or incomplete documentation. And then we did a detailed review of randomly selected individuals to simulate how the state might do an auditing process, and found that that took about 10 to 20 minutes per person that we audited each month. And so I'm going to, unless I have other questions, I'm going to move on to Autopilot. So Miles Exempt, of course, is the manual. It's the dumb technology free way, so to speak, that the state could implement an exemption program. Autopilot is quite the opposite. It is the tech-heavy, telematics-based option where you could set up a program so that the miles would automatically be recorded and reported to the state, and then the exemptions could be taken out. So that's one of the key uses that could exist for this Autopilot. So the objectives here were to test the viability. This is using new telematics technology. And then we also wanted to assess the user experience. So we did have about 10% of total respondents reply that they were interested in Autopilot. I will note we did indicate in the process that this might be a higher cost option because there's administrative costs that other users wouldn't have to pay. And so overall, we ended up recruiting 24 total participants. 22 of those were Tesla owners, and we had a Chrysler and a Jeep owner. We did have a limited pool of vehicles that was eligible, which we'll get into in a minute. So that affected sort of the Chrysler Jeep pool size. We'll talk here about user experience and the technical readiness. So we're introducing a new term there, but we wanted to talk a bit about how the data actually looks when it's being collected, and how useful the current telematics data that you can recoup from a car computer is. And so the user experience takeaways, we start with two different pools, right? We had indirect access and direct access. And so what happened here is there's different ways to get at the data that's on the car computer. We found a vendor that could help us provide indirect access. What that means is it's different than direct access, which is like OEM technologies. So the indirect access required the user to have a separate subscription and app that would actually go into the car computer on behalf of the vendor and extract the data. This process can affect battery drain on the vehicle itself, and so it's limited by the data supplier, how frequently you can ping the vehicle to collect information. And you can only collect the data at one time when you go to it. You just get that moment's information, that moment's odometer and GPS information. Direct access, on the other hand, is built-in manufacturer telematics. And so this is the onboard computer that's always collecting information. And in fact, with our supplier, the manufacturers already routinely collecting all of this data. They're bundling it into packets, and then they're sending it to the manufacturer independent of us even being in the conversation. And so there's much greater amount of data that's available and at much better resolution. And so they're quite different programs. And so we'll have sort of different findings as we get into the technical approach. But overall, what I would say is from the user experience, most everybody liked either option. People were happy with the sign-up process, the process data results, which we asked them, does the data that we're sending back to you about how many exempt miles you drove make sense to you? Do you agree that that's how many you drove? So we were doing sort of a back check on the validity of the technology itself. And then they also liked the invoicing format that we used. So people were generally happy from a user perspective. Next, we'll talk technical readiness. So like I was alluding to, that indirect access is limited in the number of intervals. And so we were actually restricted from asking for the data from the car more than every 60 minutes in our pilot. And so this greatly limits, I guess, the amount of data that we would be able to collect, and could have an impact on the ability to, especially to collect private road details, because unless you're on a private road for more than an hour, you're not getting very much information or enough information to do the exemption calculations. But it also could limit even out-of-state trips if they were short trips across the border and back. And we also experienced some technical challenges due to sort of losing access to the download process during the experiment from the indirect access. Direct access was much more successful. We had a lot more data, and it was better data. But we were limited by the number of vehicle models that we could include in our experiment. Even among the vendor that we were purchasing data from, we could only really ask for very new vehicles. And then even among that, not all of the vehicles that they told us were eligible were actually eligible. So there's an issue of expandability or scalability of the direct access at this time with the OEMs. And you would have to work with each OEM independently, or you would have to have your vendor work with each OEM independently in order to make this program successful. So I'm going to introduce our partner here, Eleanor Joseph. She's with VIA Mobility, and when we were designing the original follow-on, we wanted to find a technology vendor or support that could step in and help us simulate how the state might work with their own technology provider or autopilot data provider in the future. And so she and her team were actually the ones who coordinated with the vendors themselves, received and processed the data, and then they provided, her team provided back to us the processed miles exempt or exempt miles information. And then a lot of summaries and findings that I've just shared and that she's going to share. So I'll introduce, welcome Eleanor, and have her present for a minute this slide.
Thanks so much, Stephen. And just want to thank Stephen and the larger CDM Smith team for including us on the autopilot follow-on experience. This was a great experience for us. Just to more broadly introduce myself and my company, VIA Mobility is part of VIA Transportation, which is a transportation technology company. We operate in the road use charging space as an account manager, and we have been working very closely with OEMs to try to continually bring them into the fold on road use charging. We do think they're an important part of this ecosystem, and we've been working very hard to ingest their data into our system to accurately report miles, both from an odometer perspective and from a GPS perspective. So I'll really just add on a little bit to what Stephen said. I think what we've learned through this pilot is that today, the vehicles do collect and can easily transmit odometer readings, which, as we know, is sort of the minimum viable to implement RUC. When customers opt in to allow their OEM to provide GPS data, which is a much more data-rich option, that data can be used to automatically compute exemptions, whether it's out of state or private roads. That's, like Stephen said, that's more true when you're getting the data directly from the OEM, which is, you know, the area that we are really investing in and that we think has a lot of promise. Broader coordination and collaboration with the OEMs and third-party partners will ensure broader compatibility of vehicle telemetry data for RUC services. So I think, you know, this industry and this part of the industry is still early. I think more and more there are OEMs that are getting comfortable, that are eager to understand more about RUC, that are coming to the table to learn how they can partner in this space. And we're hoping that that is something, frankly, that our public sector partners can encourage and support as well. And just as a last point, I think we found through the autopilot follow-on experience that participants were supportive of telematics as a concept, and moreover that they were comfortable with the privacy protections and data security measures that we put in place, which is obviously very important if you're asking individuals to share their GPS data. So I think with that, I will turn it back to Stephen unless there are any questions about us or our participation.
Yeah, thank you, Eleanor. This is your question, your chance, I guess, if there's any questions. We have the expert in the room. All right. Good.
Bill, I think your hand is newly up.
Yeah, if I can chime in. The way that I envision this happening with basically the autopilot thing is, I don't want my data to be handled by a third party that the state has access to. But is it possible that we can encourage other third party GPS providers to provide that report to me? So I then go in to register my car, and my evidence is I have a detailed report generated by my private provider. And I bring that in and I go, look, here's my out-of-state report, here's my off-road report. And I would feel more comfortable with that, as opposed to something that's connected to the state because of, you know, the is that public, is subject to public records requests, I mean, it's just all those things that people are worried about under privacy. But if I chose, for example, to have some third party thing, I have a mileage app on my phone for business travel and things like that, that we have a third party that would generate that report to me, I would feel comfortable if I can, you know, a state maybe come out with a standard report. This is the items that we want to see on that report. This is dates or mileage or what road or whatever that can be addressed. So at the end of the month or at the end of the year or whatever the heck it is, I could print out a report from my vendor, not your vendor. And is that something that we could somehow incorporate into this to encourage third party GPS reporters to generate that type of report?
Senator Fortunato, I think that's a great question. One of the way that we are doing it right now, which doesn't necessarily need to be the end way, is that the user signs off on the third party processing, receiving the raw GPS data, and then processing the miles by jurisdiction. And then the actual miles by jurisdiction, whether it's out of state or private roads, the aggregated miles are what is provided to the state. So the state, in the current conception of it, or the way that we've done it in the past, I should say, does not see any individual user's location data. What you're contemplating, I think, is something a little bit different, where the vendor would provide to you your aggregate, you know, you would essentially need to allow the vendor to use your GPS data for them to process that, and then they would provide to you some sort of form that basically says, here was your total mileage by jurisdiction, and you can then submit that to the state, which is frankly, I think, another way of doing it that could also work. I don't think that we have a strong opinion on this. Travis, do you want to add to that as well?
If I can dovetail that just a little bit. So I'm a big proponent of just paying this at the time of registration. The DOL sets up an account, and maybe if I want to once a month, I put $15 or $20. I just do a bill pay and send it in, and I get an account. But it's all handled at the time of registration. And so now I have this private report that when I go in to pay, at the end of the year, I register my car. And it says this much money you have in your account, here's my exemptions, and then that's all handled manually when you go to register your car. So that's the way I envision this, as opposed to the pilot program had the third-party vendor actually computing the mileage and the gas tax, as I recall, and then generating a report on how much money you owe. Is that correct?
Generally speaking, yes, that's right.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I might add on, and then I know we have other questions. Senator Fortunato, I think the key policy feature that comes into play for what you just laid out is allowing customers to choose, right, which method they use for demonstrating their exempt miles or out-of-state driving, for example, which is pretty similar to the Oregon system, which is an open market, which means any vendor that is certified to do so can come into the market and the customer can choose which vendor to work with. I think that piece of certification is important to go along with the customer choice, so the state can trust, okay, you used vendor X, we can trust what you're asserting to us on your RUC. We don't need to see anything more, right, than the bottom line number that you brought us from that vendor, because it's a trusted vendor. So the user choice and the certification of the third-party vendors are the two pieces that Oregon has used to create a system very similar to what you just described.
But does the third-party vendor in Oregon collect the money? Do I pay the third-party?
Yes.
Or do I pay the state?
You pay the third-party vendor, and then they remit the money to the state. But you could imagine a system in Utah. In fact, the customer pays the money directly to the state. The vendor just does the calculation and tells the customer how much to pay.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, go ahead, Bo.
Thanks. Yeah, I just, this is Bo from Department of Licensing. I'll just say, like, from the sort of administering state agency perspective, you know, I think that would be a concern, though, Senator Fortunato, of not having access. Now, we certainly wouldn't need sort of the raw where the person traveled, but the rolled up data. I think, like, just not being able to get that directly from the vendor electronically would be sort of a concern in terms of just administrative efficiency. And now, perhaps if I know that different states have done different models, and some models it's highly outsourced, you know, payment, everything, right? And then it's just the funds are remitted to the state, and there's some ability to audit the vendor and make sure they're complying. I mean, maybe in that scenario there'd be less need, but I do think that would be a concern for us, not having access to the actual aggregated data itself.
If I could chime in.
Yeah, go for it.
I know Sharon had her hand up, but this would actually be no different than just having a manual system where somebody takes the picture of their odometer. So the state would basically be out of it. You wouldn't have to have the thing. You're relying on that person to basically sign this standard form that the state would generate, and they would sign it and say, under penalty of going to prison for 25 years, you know, everything I say on here is true and correct. And then you just go in because the manual system is going to have to be done at time of registration. So the third party, the person that handles the registration would basically, I walk in, the way I imagine this is, I walk in and I say, time to register my car. They know how many miles I had on the car last year. And I say, I got this many miles on the car this year. You know, I verbally tell them that. And they go, okay. And then here is my affidavit for mileage, off-road mileage or whatever. They then type in the thing and they go to DOL, and DOL says, this person has $100 in their RUC account, and you owe $90. So you're covered. You don't pay anything extra for RUC when you register your car because you got more money in your RUC account. If if the RUC account, if you're owed $150 and you got $100 in the RUC account, they apply that to the thing, and now that person pays $50. But the affidavit is a paper affidavit that they're submitting at the time when they register their car. So the state doesn't have any need to actually know that data. They would have that paper form, or I don't know, maybe we can figure out a way to transfer that. And you don't really need to even see that. When that person then sells the car, that's when everything comes into play. If that person during that process submitted an incorrect mileage number, or was trying to cheat and lower his mileage number, when they go to sell the car dealer then says, how many miles are on the car? What was the last reporting mileage? How many miles are in the RUC account? And this is the same thing as checking the bank to see what the payoff is and all that. But so that's the way I would imagine that happening. So, okay, thank you.
Yeah, Sharon, did you still have a comment you wanted to make?
It's more a comment now than anything. I want to hear more from Eleanor, if she stays that long, about when we get to the policy section, because it seems to me the problem, I'm a 10-year veteran of this committee, and it just seems to me that we will never get traction with our legislature here until we have more states combining to get the manufacturers to do more telematics in the car. You need some kind of critical mass where people trust, that's the word, trust that the system will work in their favor. You know, I really do think that the drill we've just been through using paper and so on is that's just not going to work in our current technological environment. So getting scale with the states who are doing RUCs to get some, I hope your company, and I'm sure it is working with the manufacturers to try to get some more interest in promoting and enabling this new system to work. Thanks.
Yeah, Eleanor, do you want to add anything? I know we've had a lot of discussion about the OEMs themselves internally as a team. Is there anything you want to add about?
I'll just mention, thank you for the point. I'll just mention that each OEM, you know, there's actually not one size fits all on the OEMs themselves. Some OEMs do see that they need to move this direction because revenue collection is going to move this direction, and for us to continue to have high quality roads for people to drive their vehicles on, it makes sense for them to participate in this, and that having a seat at the table in the design of the system is better than not having a seat at the table in the design of the system. And so we have crossed paths with some very interested OEMs. Then there are other OEMs that, you know, sort of want to see how the industry unfolds, are not going to be sort of first movers in this space, or a little bit more conservative. I do think there's a role for coalitions of states like you're suggesting. I also think there's a role potentially for the federal government, which, as I'm sure you know, is increasingly looking at this space. So I can't promise anything, but certainly we very much support legislative work on this and different states coming together. And I'd be happy to talk more offline if that were helpful.
Ed, why don't you go ahead and go?
So this kind of goes back to what the senator was talking about in response to Bo and the auditing. You know, if what the senator was talking about was a third-party report that would be provided to, you know, to Department of Licensing or Department of Licensing agent. It's a third-party report. And you're saying, no, that's not good enough because you need the raw data. Well, Bo, I have been to Eastern Washington 4 times this year, in which I used I-84 and I-82 in Oregon. So about 380 miles 4 times. is going to way exceed the 200-mile exemption for out of state or non-in-state roadways. So how are you going to audit me then? Are you coming after my telematics in my car? I mean, if you can't accept what Senator Fortunato had talked about a report from a third-party vendor, then how are you going to accept the report from me and other individuals who are doing the same thing as I do? And quite frankly, for everybody, I fuel up in Vancouver, so I'm paying Washington gas tax, and then I go travel on Oregon roads.
Yeah, thank you, Representative Orcutt. Bo, do you want to address whichever parts of anything you want?
And so, and I think the point is, and obviously, consultants or Transportation Commission correct me if I got this wrong, but I think, we've been having this discussion. The point is that there could be multiple reporting options available for people depending on what they're comfortable with. And some, as Senator Fortunato pointed out, could be more basic. And obviously the legislature is going to have to make the call on if they're comfortable with, a policy, an attestation essentially, right, of miles that are driven. But if you're going to go the route of having the OEM and having, the efficiencies built in of that system, then you want to be able to get the data directly from the source, from the vendor, right? And that might just be the report from the vendor, but you want to be able to, as the administrative agency, get that directly from the vendor, because that's sort of the beauty of that model, is that it's sort of automated. It's, automated tracking taxable versus untaxable, or chargeable versus unchargeable, whatever the right term there is, miles, and just sending that to the system. And so we know how much to collect. We don't have to do a lot of manual work to administer that. But that's not the only way it could be done. If people weren't comfortable using that system, or they weren't able to because their vehicle was too old, or all these other things, there could be other options to still collect it. And so that was just my only point, is if you're going to have that, you want to make sure you can actually harness the efficiencies that system would offer you.
So I'll just, if I can just cut in real quick, I can tell you the people in my district do not like this idea at all. They believe it is a huge invasion of privacy. They're very concerned about it. And when we start talking about auditing, you put options out there where you can self-report. Well, how are you going to do the auditing then? How invasive, intrusive are you going to be into their lives, into their privacy, into their driving habits, to find out whether their self-reporting is verified or verifiable, if you've got to go to such extreme lengths with the reporting from the third-party vendor? I mean, this is just going to create even more angst, more reluctance, more opposition from people in my district based on what's been described here today.
Can I ask a quick question, Representative? The concern you just expressed from your constituency, is the concern with sharing aggregated miles by district, or is it by sharing raw GPS location? So Eleanor Joseph was at this place at this time. I'm just curious.
Basically, it's any of it. They do not trust the system at all.
Yeah.
Look at all the data breaches that there have been from very high tech, very well-known, previously well-respected companies. I mean, people that keep our credit ratings have had data breaches. We've had state government agencies that have had data breaches. People are not particularly trusting of the internet right now, or anything computer generated, just because of all the data breaches that have happened. So people in my district that I hear from regarding this are very, very concerned about what level of intrusiveness you're going to get to. And it doesn't matter where you start. The concern is where it could end up going at some point in the future. And that's where the problems come in. So there's got to be some way, some certainty and some show that there's going to be a way of reporting that's going to be respected by the Department of Licensing that is not going to be intrusive. And anything, even if the way they do it is not intrusive, if you do something that feels intrusive, one of the options feels intrusive, they're wondering how long it's going to be before you get that intrusive on them.
If I could just offer one perspective, and I know Chair Jennings, we need to probably move on. I think the Bo's perspective from DOL is important, but I'll go back to what I said a moment ago, which is that the relationship between the end customer and whoever is providing the data collection and analysis services, whether it's their vehicle itself or a third-party intermediary, the customer owns the decision of whether or not to use such a provider, and also owns the data that's collected between them and that person, not the government. And what is needed in order to process a RUC transaction with exemptions is simply total miles driven. And if you are requesting exemptions for out of state, total miles driven out of state as reported by a trusted vendor. So the key becomes, can the Department of Licensing trust the vendor? And again, that's where the programs that have developed to date in Utah and Oregon, and increasingly in other states, are focusing on the state's role is to certify that the vendor is a good actor that's collecting the data in a good manner, but doesn't need to be involved in looking at individuals' driving data or location data, doesn't need any of the details, simply needs the number at the end of the day. And that can be provided by the third-party vendor or by the customer themselves.
Okay, Bo, do you have something real quick?
Yeah, just real quick, Mr. Chairman, I'll just say, I totally hear you, Rep. Orcutt and Senator Fortunato, and I think there could also be very low-tech options that, don't have people have to report that. I mean, I think, and I think we've looked at ways that could be structured, right? Where I think Senator Fortunato talked about just a bulk, you just buy a block of miles and that's that, and there's no tracking or reporting. So, I mean, I think there can be a range of options, and I hear your concerns on that, certainly, Representative Orcutt.
All right, these were a lot of great questions. Stephen, are you done?
We are. Thank you for the time.
Okay.
If I can.
We got to, I'm sorry, we got
I
to
know.
get moving. We are over time at the moment by 7 or 8 minutes. You're into your break, and if we keep doing this, you're not going to get one. So next up, for the second time, we're now going to hand it off to Monica so that she can share the results about the Mock Standards Committee.
Here we go. I am ready.
Cool.
So one of the tasks in the work project was to convene a mock standards committee. The committee members included the Washington State Transportation Commission, the Washington State Department of Labor, Departments of Transportation from Oregon, Utah, and Hawaii, the Eastern Transportation Coalition, AMVA, 2 private sector vendors involved in RUC technology and account management, and the Federal Highway Administration. The rationale for convening this committee was that the RUC environment, meaning all of the actors involved in road usage charging, jurisdictional agencies, third-party vendors, and road users, would benefit from a standardized set of requirements that must be true for all road usage charge programs. These standards would provide a common language and rules that these actors could rely upon to implement and operate their programs. Committee objectives included the identification of RUC elements that will benefit from standardization. These elements were evaluated for the readiness of the community to accept a standard and the ease of establishing the standard. We then examined each possible standard to determine whether jurisdictional regulations were likely to make a single standard unreachable. If that conflict was found, the element was identified as one more appropriate for best practices than for standardization. Next, the committee identified preferred parameters for convening a national standards committee. Due to the nature of standards, participation from a wider cohort of interested parties is beneficial. Leveraging information from existing standards organizations, the committee established a set of procedures for operating a standards committee. The committee then explored different pathways for setting up a national standards committee, including analyzing the benefits and challenges associated with different types of organizations that might be suited to leading the RUC standardization effort. Finally, the committee developed a set of criteria for convening a standards committee. A future standards committee will be able to make this committee's work, take it and move it forward with a plan in place for RUC standardization. The International Organization for Standardization, known as ISO, is an independent organization whose membership includes 169 national standards bodies. This committee referenced ISO's processes and procedures frequently during our RUC standardization work. ISO identifies these 9 standardization principles. So to operate with transparency, a committee would be clear about the rules, plans, processes associated with establishing standards. This clarity includes timely notification of standardization work to interested parties, the sharing of a draft standard, providing review time and responses to comments on the draft standards, and prompt publication of an adopted standard. The principle of openness refers to welcoming collaboration in all facets of the process, from the selection of the standards to be developed through technical discussions and up to the voting for the adoption of the standards. Impartiality is the absence of bias or prejudice. Standards are established based on an objective criteria, considering all alternatives without preference for a particular solution. Consensus is a general agreement without sustained opposition from any significant portion of the interested parties through a process that considers the views of all parties. Consensus doesn't mean unanimity, but it allows alternative viewpoints to be heard and vetted. Effectiveness and relevance are characterized by the timely addressing of a quantified need with a clear explanation of the solution relevant to the bulk of potential users. Coherence is formulating a unified approach that's logical and consistent. This includes avoiding overlap with other standardizing bodies working on RUC elements. So coherence isn't within one committee, it applies to the larger RUC environment. The development dimension for ISO describes the removal of barriers for developing nations to participate in standards development. For a RUC standards committee, this would be defined as inclusion of those interested parties who've made less progress along the road usage charging path than others. Stakeholder outreach involves making interested parties or potentially interested parties aware of the benefits of standardization to encourage them to become part of the standardization process. Due process refers to formal proceedings carried out according to the established rules to resolve differences in the standard setting activities. Finally, national implementation of standards will help facilitate RUC-related innovation and commerce. National implementation will require separate adoption of standards by many interested parties, unless a national adoption mechanism is developed, probably by the federal government. The committee identified 23 potential standards and 26 potential best practices by scrutinizing the 9 elements of RUC and identifying particular facets of each element that could be standardized. These potential standards and best practices were then prioritized according to the ease of implementation and the RUC community's readiness for the standard. Okay. Following the first 4 steps of the Health Standards Organization's standards development process, the committee developed 2 proposed standards, the Juris ID standard and the Vehicle Classification standard. Okay. The proposed Juris ID standard establishes a common set of codes for each state-level jurisdiction. This set of codes provides a common language to identify the jurisdiction in which mileage was accrued for shared reporting between jurisdictions. This standard is needed by jurisdictions and vendors to simplify the reporting of interjurisdictional travel. The Jurist ID standard table includes codes for all U.S. states and territories, Canadian provinces and territories, and Mexican states. For example, the Jurist ID for Washington is 053. The Juris ID table also includes space for future state or territorial expansion through the use of the reserved Juris IDs. You can see 043 and 007 are reserved for future expansion. The second proposed standard developed by the committee is the Vehicle Classification Standard. The Vehicle Classification Standard establishes names, definitions, and valid values for identifying vehicle types. The standard also defines the source from which those identifying elements should be drawn and includes additional information and the rationale for the standardization of that element. This standard will enable all jurisdictions to use common language and data sources to identify vehicle types, thus supporting communication between jurisdictions and providing vendors with a common dictionary to help develop RUC products. The committee evaluated 3 types of existing organizations that have committees engaged in standardization activities. Jurisdiction-led organizations such as AAMVA, IRP, and IFTA, industry-led organizations such as IBTTA, ITS America, and researcher-led or standards development organizations such as SAE or IEEE. The committee identified opportunities and challenges associated with each organizational type and then developed an ideal joint committee drawing from the strengths of each organizational type. The ideal organizational type would include membership from different types of state agencies, such as DOTs, DOLs, DORs, and BMVs, industry, non-governmental associations, and relevant federal partners. The committee proposes a structure with a steering committee overseeing subcommittees composed of subject matter experts. The expertise needed for each of the potential standards was identified by this committee. Necessary components of a standards committee charter and operating rules were outlined, as well as an evaluation of reporting and resources needed. Okay. This slide is a summary of the accomplishments of the WARUC Mock Standards Committee. We've discussed the last 4 in some detail here. The first item owes to the foresight of the project sponsor and the steering committee to initiate this work, as well as the willingness of committee members to fully engage in the process and provide their expertise. The committee found that the standardization work to be vital to the success of road usage charging and expressed strong interest in continuing this effort. Through its work, this committee identified 6 primary benefits of standardization. Standards reduce the cost of collection by providing a foundation for jurisdictions and vendors to rely upon, instead of having to start from scratch with each new program. They ease the implementation of RUC programs by providing a roadmap for program initiation, setup, and operationalization. Standards support an open market and competition by clearly identifying the requirements for new products and services while leaving some parameters open to innovation and jurisdictional discretion. The existence of standards will support nationwide consistency of RUC program implementation. States will always make distinct policy and programmatic choices. This is inevitable and valuable as each state must respond to its own unique circumstances and needs. Given these factors, standards will provide a common language and framework to ensure that the programs throughout the country have a better chance of cooperating in the long run for the benefit of customers and driving down operating costs. And the establishment of standards supports the scalability of various technological solutions by identifying areas that must be consistent, allowing vendors and jurisdictions to expand programs based on proven solutions. Finally, standards support interoperability by providing this common language, communications, and processes to be shared by all participating jurisdictions. Okay. The primary lesson that we learned in this committee is that RUC is ready for standardization. The committee demonstrated a viable approach to developing standards, including the prioritization of the most critical standards, the inclusion of jurisdictions at varying stages of development for additional perspectives, the recommendation of a steering and subcommittee structure to accelerate the standards development, and the use of established best practices for meetings. So the opportunity is ripe for RUC standards development. Convening a committee such as recommended by this committee will provide a great service to the larger RUC committee by establishing a proven foundation for validating RUC elements and processes. We all look forward to the next step in this committee's work. Thank you.
All right, are there any questions? Seeing none, we'll take a 15-minute break. Be back at 10:30. All right, welcome back. Now Gigi will give us some information about the Forward Drive final report and the next steps. Take it
Great.
away, Gigi.
Thank you, Chair. So, with all of these exciting results, I'm sure everybody is eagerly anticipating the final report. So I'll go over some of the initial findings, a summary of what that will include, some of the initial findings and conclusions, and then the schedule for when that will be coming out. So the final report will consist of 2 volumes. Volume 1 will be the main body of the report. It will include the executive summary, the introduction to the project, describe the research approach and findings for the main tasks, and these included the financial analyses, the equity outreach and analysis, technology innovation and user experience research, the cost reduction workshop, and the pilot, which consists of what we heard about earlier today, the simulator and the follow-on experiences. And all of this will lead to a set of conclusions and next steps. The second volume of the final report will include all of the technical appendices with the nitty-gritty details on the research, simulation, statistics, the pilot, the testing, the analysis, and the next steps. So a lot of appendices in there especially for other researchers interested in how that all came together. So the Forward Drive project both confirmed prior findings and also really pushed the boundaries on how to design and implement a RUC that would meet policy objectives, equity, acceptability, low cost, and user friendliness. And as you heard today, the research leveraged the latest practices in user design, RUC and transportation revenue innovations, developed partnerships, and brought RUC implementers together to share experiences and pave the way forward for RUC, including collaborating to make RUC easier to understand for the general public, easier for states to deploy, the messaging, and drive administration costs down over time. So these led to these 7 overall conclusive statements. There are no recommendations in this report. And then what we'll do is after we review this initial list at the high level, I'll go through each of these conclusions one by one. Okay, so the summary of final report conclusions. Number 1, steeper gas tax revenue losses exacerbate transportation funding challenges and equity concerns. 2, among transportation revenue choices, RUC performs strongest for social equity and user equity. 3, public acceptance of RUC in Washington has grown with exposure to the concept. 4, enrollment and odometer declaration is viable today, a simple, low-cost, popular approach for implementing RUC in Washington. 5, telematics is currently feasible on an opt-in basis for some vehicles, but work remains to expand eligibility and improve the user experience. 6, alongside program implementation, additional research can improve operations, especially as other states advance programs, including multi-state research and cooperation, standards, fleet reporting, OEM telematics business case. And then 7, Forward Drive redefine what it means to conduct a RUC pilot. Okay, so we'll start with conclusion number 1. So conclusion number 1 comes from task 1, the financial analyses, and task 2, the equity outreach and analysis. So EV adoption trends are exceeding many people's expectations, and Washington currently ranks 2nd in the nation in zero emissions vehicle adoption rates, with a goal of ZEVs making up 100% of new sales by 2035. So the latest analysis shows that conventional vehicle fuel economy will continue to contribute significantly to the decline of transportation revenue. And given that fuel consumption per mile driven is already highest in rural areas and areas with below average household incomes, Looking forward, the burden of fuel costs and fuel taxes is likely to further concentrate on those demographics. Okay, conclusion number 2. This conclusion confirms that the prior findings that the pay per mile concept is equitable. This is true both for user and social equity, as RUC is a more direct way to measure usage than the gas tax. So flat fees, on the other hand, ask vehicle owners to pay either too much or too little relative to road usage. RUC aligns usage and cost impacts with contributions. RUC is a more progressive funding option since per mile fuel consumption is highest in areas with lower incomes and miles driven correlates with household income. Additionally, RUC is flexible and gives policymakers the option of offering rate adjustments, discounts, and exemptions to make funding policy even more progressive. 3. So conclusion number 3 shows the progress that has been made with continued outreach and improved, streamlined, convenient user experience. So starting in 2017, the household telephone survey showed a sample of Washingtonians were 31% supportive of RUC and 58% in opposition. That seems like so long ago. In 2018 and 19, so although the last pilot was not statistically representative of the state, among neutral participants, large majorities ended the pilot with favorable views of RUC once they had some hands-on experience and understanding of what it was about. And then here we are today, a statistically representative sample of Washingtonians who experienced the RUC simulation supported RUC by a margin of 56% to 44%. Okay. Conclusion number 4 goes further to say that not only is RUC more publicly acceptable with self-reporting, but by offering some simple features, it is viable for both the state and the preferred choice for customers. So this adds the ability to provide more choices for customers, and also, for example, standard exemptions further address customer concerns. And as we discussed at length earlier, conclusion number 5 concludes that telematics is a feasible option for some vehicles, but work remains. It is an option that is maturing for both customers and OEMs. It eventually may become lower in cost. It is not yet a universal solution for all vehicles, and it's still to be determined where the industry is going and how quickly. But the issue is not as much about feasibility, it's about making it work for everybody. So other options are still needed. And this leads well into conclusion number 6, that additional continued research, particularly in collaboration with other states, can improve operations and user experience. So this is as other states continue to grow their RUC, there's a lot to be learned. Some are implementing, some are still doing research, and Washington can really learn by meeting and sharing information with other states, can reduce costs as the number of states looking at RUC increases, and also cooperation across state lines. Standards will also contribute greatly to that. And then additional research and testing on user experience for fleets and, for example, telematics as it moves. Nobody knows how quickly or which direction, but kind of following along with what OEMs are doing, and also getting that mass, increasing number of vehicles that are eligible will make a big difference there for OEMs. And finally, the final conclusion. Looking back at where we landed after these 3 years, we started the research with a dozen pilot ideas and ended up with Forward Drive, where the users benefited from a single, simple entry point to RUC, especially when faced with numerous choices. This was all captured in the simulation. And then focused, interactive, information-rich, customized experiences offer an alternative to long-term traditional pilot testing. Although upfront investment in the simulation was high, deployment across a large population of participants to collect behavioral and survey data is small. And then the simulation approach can be undertaken to address additional policy questions of interest, individually customized for the state, and as for the foundation for a more in-depth traditional pilot. So this is a useful and very insightful conclusion, not only for Washington, but as a federal grant, this is also very helpful for other states looking to move the needle on road usage charge. So here I'll put the final report conclusions back up again. And I welcome any questions, comments, and input. The team is working on finalizing all of the input here, and please share your initial reactions on these conclusions. And then also invite Travis to help answer any questions as these conclusions have been worked together as an entire team on a lot of them.
Are there any questions? Senator Fortunato.
Thank you, Roy. So, Jingjing, these final conclusions are based on just coordinating with other states and all this other stuff, as opposed to specifically Washington State. So is this specific to Washington State? So this is what we are doing as a state, or is this broader?
This is, I would say number 1 through 6 is specific to Washington State. I think number 7 basically speaks to the fact that what Washington State is doing is very much at the forefront of a lot of the research. So 1 through 6, you know, a lot of the surveys, the public acceptance, the simulator, that was all done with Washington drivers and residents. The design and research all was specific to Washington State, the policy questions and choices that were raised by all of you and that were heard from residents and drivers.
So the one big, huge quality or item that I don't really see addressed, or maybe I missed it, is the where does this money go? In other words, we have a constitutional amendment, or I ran a constitutional amendment to say, okay, the RUC money goes into the vehicle, motor vehicle account. So do we have agreement that that's where that's going or not, is the question.
So sorry, these are just the report conclusions at this point. We do have in the following section, or the last section of today's meeting, where we will talk about that particular issue, is agreement on or discussion around where that money will go.
And I could add to that, Jingjing, Senator Fortunato, that the report itself that we're working on will draw conclusions strictly from the research under Forward Drive. And the use of revenue wasn't one of the research questions that we were tasked with. That has been something the commission in previous years has weighed in on through its own recommendations, but as a product of the research from the project team and the steering committee, that's not one of the items that we'll be making a conclusion on. It's rather something that the commission has the discretion to make a recommendation, and of course, ultimately is a legislative decision.
Thank you.
Representative Orcutt.
Thank you. So under number 6, multi-state research and cooperation, my question is, once we start cooperating with and implementing with other states, does the out-of-state exclusion that I have now become just a transfer of money from our state to their state?
So that is one of the additional research questions. It's a little bit especially in the standards committee, we talked a little bit about how those decisions might be made, and you really need multiple jurisdictions with close to a real ruck to be able to have those conversations. And so a lot of the standards discussion, the prior work that Washington did with interoperability will all go to inform how that could be done. However, how jurisdictions will actually do it, I think still depends a lot on, looking and waiting for states to deploy it. So I think Washington is pursuing both sides, is looking at, okay, well, how do we handle out of state? And then having these dialogues with other states like Oregon on, okay, well, how do we actually, if you have a RUC and we have a RUC, how do we actually want to handle the financial transactions, either on the back end or the front end, by the customer or by the state, by the jurisdictions? What about a state that, is one of our neighbors that isn't collecting a RUC right now? All of those will is part of that number 6 additional research. Does that answer your question?
Oh, yeah, I believe it does.
Thank you.
Are there any
Maybe
other
we should
questions?
just point out that if you currently drive into a non-RUC state, and it's imprecise, of course, because we don't collect gas taxes for passenger vehicles based on where you drove, rather where you filled up. But the assumption is that we'll continue to rely on fuel taxes as the mechanism for driving in states that don't have RUC. So as long as a state doesn't have RUC, there would be an exemption presumed. But if they do have a RUC, then that's where there needs to be some discussion about how to work together, especially if they've also sunsetted their own gas tax.
Any other questions? Okay.
Okay, Chair, I'll continue with a little bit more about the next steps, if that's okay.
Sure.
Great. So the volume 2, following the conclusions, this will be a supporting volume. We'll have the research, the simulation and pilot testing and next steps in detail. So what we have the research, which was the tasks that I mentioned earlier. Financial analyses will have its own appendix, the equity outreach and analysis, the user experience, and the cost of collection. These will all be their separate appendices. And then there's going to be a handful, let's see, we've got 7 appendices about the simulation and pilot testing, starting with the survey results, the analytics results, and then 1 each for the follow-on experiences, the FlexPay, the autopilot, and the miles exempt. We'll also have an appendix on the vehicle transaction survey results, which is covered a little bit more about some other ways that eventually might be useful for reporting mileage. And then finally, the mock standards committee that Monica reported on today. And then finally, the last appendix will be the RUC transition roadmap. And that will be based on a lot of the discussion we're going to have later on in the rest of this meeting on what are some of the next steps based on the findings, the conclusions, and then the decisions that need to be made there. So as for timing, we are expecting that the final report will be sent to steering committee members November 13th, or the week of November 13th. This will not be a fully laid out final report. It will have the draft text, draft final text, so that, laying out takes some work if we change the text a lot. So trying to do this efficiently and get the text to all of you for review. And we're hoping to be able to get comments back in 1 week after that. The major milestone here is January 2nd. We'll be transmitting the final report to legislature. So that's what we're working towards there. Appreciate it ahead of time, all of your comments, your review, your time in helping us with reviewing this final draft and all of the input everybody has provided to date.
Any final questions for Jingjing? Well, I look forward to getting the draft final report. And with that, Travis will now give us a quick update on the National Users Fee Standards and trends. He'll follow up by prompting an open discussion on the series of key questions that lawmakers must address in creating a RUC program. Take it away, Travis.
Okay, thank you, Roy. Good morning, everyone. This will be a repeat presentation for those of you who were at the JTC meeting a couple of weeks ago with one tiny adjustment. What we wanted to share is an update on some transportation funding policy changes based on the most recent legislative sessions across the states in 2023. So the update is as follows. There were 3 states, Montana, Georgia, and Utah, that all enacted a per kilowatt hour tax on public electric vehicle charging. There are now 5 states that have such taxes on public EV charging. They all do it a little bit differently. For example, in Utah, it's basically a sales tax. And in Montana, it's collected by the utilities, not by the charging station providers themselves. The rates are generally in the ballpark for the ones that aren't a sales tax of 2 to 4 cents per kilowatt hour. And primarily, this is aimed at trying to capture revenue from out-of-state EVs that are charging while traveling in these states, since they don't pay gas tax. Since most charging happens at home, about 90% kilowatt hour tax on public EV charging is going to miss the vast majority of kilowatt hour consumption by electric vehicles. Meanwhile, 3 states have implemented electric vehicle registration fee surcharges. Washington, of course, was the first back in 2012. There are now 35 states. So this year saw Montana, New Hampshire, and Texas join the list. 2 states passed bills to implement RUC programs for electric vehicles, Hawaii and Vermont. Hawaii's program will launch in July of 2025, and it will serve as a replacement of the state's flat electric vehicle registration surcharge. And by 2028, the option of paying the surcharge will go away and the RUC participation will become mandatory for EVs, while the state looks to transition other vehicles over the next decade. Vermont's bill created a RUC program, but didn't launch it. They require an additional bill to set the rates. There's currently no rate, so they'll have the authorization to create the program, but not actually launch it until they pass a second bill to create a per mile fee. And then lastly, we had a second state. Colorado was the first 2 years ago. Minnesota became the second to implement a package delivery excise tax. This is a tax paid by the customer to the merchant when you're making a purchase of a good that is to be delivered to your home or business inside the state borders. In Colorado, it's 28 cents per order, and in Minnesota, I believe it's 50 cents per order. And the purposes of this tax is to generate revenue with a nexus to road usage, in that these delivery vehicles are replacing a lot of what used to be trips to the store or even trips to the restaurant. Now the good is coming to you. So by putting an excise tax on the delivery order, states are looking to capture some revenue from that mechanism. Looking at each of these in a little bit more zoomed in, the electric vehicle surcharges, as I mentioned, now extend across 35 states. They range from a low of $50 in Hawaii up to a high of $225 in Washington, with an asterisk because Michigan has 2 tiers of EV surcharges. They have a surcharge of $140 for vehicles under 8,000 pounds, and the fee goes up by $100 to $240 for vehicles 8,000 pounds and higher. The average is about $130, and the midpoint or median is $120. In general, the states that have enacted these fees are trying, it appears, to do so by setting the fee at a level that's approximately equal to, or in a lot of cases slightly below, what a typical gas vehicle would pay in gas taxes. In Washington, for example, 225 is a little bit below what the average gas vehicle pays in state gas taxes. That's not the exclusive approach. However, Texas, for example, did enact a fee at $200 per year, which is about double what the average gas-powered vehicle pays in state gas taxes. The logic being that they were also attempting to capture the lost federal gas taxes, which would double it from $100 to the $200 fee that is now in place in Texas for EVs. Looking to RUC, as I mentioned, Hawaii and Vermont became the 4th and 5th states. Of course, Oregon, Utah, and Virginia have programs in place. A number of states have undertaken pilots. A couple of new states have recently come online with pilots across the East Coast as part of the Eastern Transportation Coalition, including Georgia and Maine. The other states on the East Coast that have conducted pilots did so under previous rounds of the Eastern Coalition's work. Oklahoma launched a pilot earlier this year, and Kansas, which is currently shaded green, but it will turn to the darker teal color later this year or early next year when Kansas launches its RUC pilot. As well as participating in multi-state consortia. You see a lot of states in sort of yellowish color. The ones in the eastern half of the country as part of the Eastern Transportation Coalition, and the ones in the western half of the country as part of RUC America, formerly known as RUC West. And lastly, there are some activities happening federally. The CIRC grant program, CIRC stands for Strategic Innovations in Revenue Collection. CIRC was enacted as part of the bipartisan infrastructure law. It makes $75 million available to states over 5 fiscal years. It's basically a successor to the grant program that funded the forward drive research of the commission. A couple of differences between the previous STSFA grant program and the new CIRC program. Number one, the local match required has been reduced from 50% to 20% for first-time applicants and 30% for repeat applicants after the first round. There's also expanded eligibility for local governments to seek CIRC grants to conduct research on user-based funding alternatives to the gas tax. The notice of funding is expected either later this year or early in 2024. And of course, the bipartisan infrastructure law also created a national RUC pilot funded at $50 million over 5 years to be run by U.S. Department of Transportation in coordination with the Treasury. The law calls for participation from all 50 states, meaning participating vehicles from all 50 states, including both private passenger vehicles and commercial vehicles. The timeline for the launch of that pilot is unclear, but latest estimates that FHWA has shared publicly, they're looking at about a 5-year timeline for launch of that program. I'll pause there to see if there's any questions on the national update, and we're a little bit ahead of schedule before I turn to the final topic for today, which is more of an open discussion.
Any questions?
Okay. Seeing none, hearing none. The last agenda item, we'll have an hour for this, is titled Preparing for Legislation and Open Discussion of RUC Issues. And I'd like to invite Representative Fye if he'd like to share some opening remarks, if he's still on the call. But we needed to solicit some input from the steering committee for our last remaining task under the Forward Drive project, which is to prepare what's called a roadmap. That was one of the scope items we promised to FHWA of what are some possible transition approaches for starting and then evolving a road usage charge program, which of course involves addressing a lot of policy questions. So Representative Fye, I don't know if you had any opening remarks before I launch into the meat of this part of the presentation.
Sure, thank you very much. So as many of you may know, I introduced a bill last session to get some discussion going with respect to the state moving more assertively towards adoption of a road usage charge of some form. It wasn't the first time bills of that nature have been before the legislature. But what has become apparent to me and some of my colleagues is that we really need to, we've done research quite a bit. Other states have done research quite a bit, but we're getting towards the point of where we need to start actually getting deeper into the specific issues, identifying the tougher issues that need to get resolved in order to have a successful road usage charge implemented in the state of Washington. I could go on and on about our increasing transportation costs with respect to our interstate and local transportation systems, but I think that's pretty evident already. And now we're experiencing increased costs for construction in particular, but all costs related to transportation. So I've had the conversation with the good staff that's been working on this, on the RUC program, and it occurred to me, I sort of have kind of a schedule in mind about how to go about doing that. And here's what my thoughts were, is that today we would spend some time talking about what the major issues are, not getting into answering how we're going to resolve them, but to discuss what the major issues are. And then we would follow on, my plan would be to follow on this year before the start of session with a session that involves you folks who have been involved and are deeply engaged and have a wealth of knowledge on all the work that's gone on to date within the state and beyond, about what the big issues are that need to get resolved. I would hold a second session for those folks who aren't as deeply engaged, but have a stake in the outcome, that really haven't participated in the way the folks that have for the last 10 years for some of you. And all for the purpose of, after the legislative session coming up in 2024, to have some more meaningful stakeholder conversations to see if we can resolve some of these issues and put a bit of a roadmap together about how we would implement a road usage charge of some kind. That's kind of my game plan. And what we did with the help with the consultants and commission staff was to identify ahead of time some of the major topic areas today that we could discuss today, to see if we've got those, if we got the right ones down. And then we could spend time adding to the list. If there's some more things that people really think need to be resolved in what we've already identified, so that we can prepare between now and the end of the year of holding these two sessions again, one with the membership of this group and one with stakeholders who have not been engaged, but will have a role to play in working through the issues so that we can move forward at some point in time with a road usage charge. I'd like to keep the momentum going on this topic, because the situation only gets worse and worse with respect to the shortfall that we have in our transportation revenue needs. And I think
for some reason, well,
pardon me?
No, my mistake.
Anyway, I think I've covered the topic here. If there's any questions about this, but this is gonna, I thought, why we have the good folks here that have been participating, we could get some reaction to the identification of the issues today for the balance of this meeting, and then we will get with this group into that more in depth between now and the start of the legislative session. So
Thank you.
go ahead.
Sorry. Oh, thank you, Chair Fye. I appreciate that orientation. And then again, as a project team perspective, we'll be listening and taking notes to your feedback throughout this 10 or so slide presentation. Oh, there you are. Presentation and looking to compile the feedback into our final task deliverable for FHWA, which hopefully will also, of course, serve your purposes as a deliberating body. Okay, so I'm going to jump right in. We identified 9 questions that we think are the key or essential questions to answer legislatively in order to establish a RUC program. We will walk through each of these one by one. And again, our purpose is not to answer each question. I don't think that would be possible, especially if we were to attempt to do it on a consensus basis, as this group has historically operated. We know that many of these questions are ultimately going to be decided by the legislature. It must be decided by the legislature. Our hope today is to accomplish 3 things. Number 1, confirm, is this the right list of questions? Are there additional features or questions that we should be asking and coming forward with information to help address? So is this the right and complete list is question 1. Question 2 is, as we walk through them, for each question, we have prepared a very brief sort of multiple choice. Here are some choices or options for how you might address each question. In some cases, you can pick more than one choice to create policy. In other cases, you frankly have to pick one. And again, we're not attempting to converge on a single choice for each of these questions today, but rather to answer to get your feedback as to whether or not our list of choices is complete. And then finally, our third hope, and we'll finish the day with a poll, and polls are always risky, especially when they're done remote and electronically, but to get a sense of the room of how important relatively are each of these questions to all of you as members of this committee who've been working on this issue for the last decade or more. So we'll finish with an attempt to rank order from 1 to 9 out of these questions, what's most important, what's least important, and we'll launch a poll at the end to try and capture that. So I will walk through these one by one, and I will pause on each slide to hear feedback as to the choices that we've presented for each question. And then at the conclusion, I'll open it up to see if you have feedback about additional questions that we should be posing. So without further ado, the first question on initial creation of a RUC program is which vehicles are subject to a road usage charge? And choices that we have presented are, first of all, a sort of a gating decision on whether the initial program is voluntary in nature or mandatory in nature. And then secondly, regardless of that, which vehicles are either eligible in the case of voluntary or subject in the case of mandatory to a road usage charge. And we've come up with several ways that you could identify subject vehicles for an initial program. One would be based on an MPG rating threshold. 2 would be based on the model year of the vehicles, for example, picking a future new model year and vehicles newer than that. 3rd would be a motor or engine type basis, looking strictly at electric and or plug-in hybrids or hybrids. And then of course there are combinations of those first 4 choices. And lastly, ripping the Band-Aid off and saying all vehicles is certainly, technically speaking, an option. So this is our first policy question that we wanted to tee up and get your take on whether this is a complete set of choices and any other discussion points you'd like to raise about this question. Sharon.
I'm sorry, I'm working from my iPad and I don't use it very often for these meetings. just so I understand what we're about to do now, we're going to create a list of questions that the state legislative committees will then go through. Is that what I'm understanding? Because yeah, these look like all the right questions, and it looks like all the questions we've been studying for a long time. So I'm sorry, with some respect, I want to say, has the legislature read any of our reports from the last 10 years? I mean, I'm serious about that because it just is, it seems sort of insulting to ask the committee to come before and to do these debates in 2-minute segments, which is how the state legislature hears from its residents and its citizens about policy issues. It's just, we've been doing this work and we've made a recommendation. So I'm wondering what is going to happen in these two meetings before January 2nd or whenever the legislature convenes. I'm sorry to be so impatient, but it seems to me like a bit of it seems very redundant. Yeah.
I'll try to answer that, and I think that's appropriate, especially for you, because you're one of the people that have spent the most time on this. So this piece of it is to the work today is to, do we have the right questions? The work that will happen in a couple of meetings yet this year will be to have a discussion about each of these questions and to understand which ones are the most critical to get agreement on in order to move forward with a proposal. Where do we need our time to spend the legislature on resolving with stakeholders, resolving these issues so that we can move forward. I get that the committee has made recommendations, and in some areas, I would say that I would postulate haven't made recommendations in every one of the ones that you've seen. I mean, you've been exposed to studies and you've made reviewed reports, but now we're getting more to brass tacks for work after the 2024 session so that we can have a bill that addresses the issues, that has had good conversation, that includes the stakeholders, including yourself, to actually have some of these things so we can move the ball forward. So this is my suggestion about how we go forward. It's to really, we really haven't done what I would call in this regard, work that I've for instance, that I and others did in developing a green transportation bill or developing a transportation package. We've had advisory groups, we've had reports, but we haven't gotten down to talking about, okay, what are the elements of this program going to be, and have the stakeholders weigh in so that we can have legislation that we have some hope that can move us towards getting started on implementing a RUC. That's what my intent is. So, and my feeling was that this group, given the knowledge and the exposure you've had, would be the best one to come to first and say, do we have the right questions here? And then we can have a conversation with you about what are the best solutions in each of these areas.
Right. One follow-up then, Senator. So you're thinking it would be perhaps beyond a pilot project, that this might be
yes,
a more permanent approach. Okay.
a roadmap to get to a permanent.
Okay, that helps me. Thank you.
I see Neil, and I also see Judy literally raising her hand. So I'll go to Neil first and then come down to Judy.
I guess I just want to say, thanks, Representative Phi, for putting this together. I completely agree with you that, we in the committee, I've been on the committee since 2012 when it started, and we've been wrestling with this for a long time and wrestling with all of these questions, but it kind of feels like we've left the legislature behind, not out of any fault of our own, but just because, it hasn't been something that's been real. And so I think we need to really start having real conversations about whether this is feasible. And I think the problems that you're trying to solve are political challenges. How do we actually go about implementing this in a way that that people could buy, or maybe they can, but we need to get to the bottom of whether we can and what the plan is. And my opinion on this first question is that these are the right questions, that there has to be some sort of implementation schedule where you start adding cars onto the ruck, but you can't do it all at once with all vehicles. So there's got to be some combination of this list that gets them, and I think these are the right questions.
Thank you, Neil. Judy, and then I'll come up, Senator Fortunato, to you.
So I agree with everything that's been said, and I just wanted to share that my first question that I had in my mind that everybody should start with, because nobody else has gone through this process, is why. And so even though we're talking about the individual things that we're going to do, I would imagine most of the people in the legislature don't even understand completely why. And the outside community doesn't understand why. And I don't think people even on this committee always seem to understand why. So having that incorporated in how we present everything, I think will make it easier to follow as people understand that we really need to do this. And it's not just a new way of getting money. It's actually making sure we have money, because our other money is disappearing.
Thank you, Judy. Senator Fortunato.
Yeah, thank you. I think the biggest roadblock you face with the public, as Rep. Orcutt pointed out, is privacy issues. But in addition to that, you have the misconception that this is in addition to the gas tax. It's an additional tax on top of the gas tax. So, and everything we're talking about is a gas tax credit against the mileage tax. So that needs to be communicated. The other thing is when you're talking about an MPG threshold, I think that's a good question to ask, because if you figure a vehicle getting 20 miles to the gallon or less, and 20 miles to the gallon, 5 miles for a 100 mile, 5 gallons for 100 miles, 49 cents times 5 is $2.45. 2.4 cents a mile is something like, or it's the other way around, anyway, it's about the same. So at 20 miles to the gallon or less at 2.4 cents a mile, it's a wash. It's zero or pretty close. So if we were to first exempt cars that have mileage 20 miles per the gallon or less, that would allow us to focus in on the cars that are actually not carrying the majority of the burden, and eliminates a whole bunch of things. So as we transition, and as that, and we all know this is going to go up. It's not going to be 2.4 cents. It's going to go up. So as that goes up, we need to find that 0 miles per gallon and just incrementally add those things. So that's my suggestion, is to start off with exempting people 20 miles to the gallon or less.
Thank you, and appreciate the suggestion, and also reminds me that I should point out for each of these choices on all the questions, there are obviously pros and cons from both a policy standpoint and also an operations standpoint. I'll just point out 2 examples. There are some plug-in hybrid electric vehicles that get 15 miles per gallon. They're high performance sports vehicles that they do 5 miles electric and then they revert to gasoline engine that's a guzzler. So and also with the MPG threshold idea, of course, there's the issue of operating that and finding the ratings and putting it into the vehicle registry and relying on it. So there are obviously some trade-offs for each of these choices that we would be pointing out that are a reflection of all the research that's been done over the years alongside each of these choices. Tom, I believe
just for full disclosure,
sorry,
my car gets 19.5 miles to the gallon.
So you're contributing your fair share. Thank you. Tom, we'll come to you next.
Okay, thank you. So I think these are all the right questions. The one subset I would ask, is there a threshold of usefulness in voluntary. So if we're trying to keep costs down and try to make this useful at the beginning, is there some number that we would want to see in a voluntary to make it worth it?
Thank you for that suggestion. I like that. Bo, I'll come to you next.
Yeah, I think these are good questions as well. From an administrative standpoint, it's very important to ramp up, right? To not go all. And I don't think anyone disagrees with that, but I do think if that's something that we can channel, that, you know, like incrementally adding vehicles is very important versus trying to go 8 million all at once. And I think to one of the points raised earlier, not having to do a credit will simplify the administration initially. So trying to target classes of vehicles where that, just by the nature of that vehicle, that would not be necessary, would administratively be beneficial. I think, you know, similar to one of the policy questions the legislature has previously wrestled with is whether you want to provide relief on like electric vehicle hybrid fees for those that do the program. And that might be a subsequent question that's already on this list. I just couldn't remember everything that was there, but I think that might be something to talk about as well.
Thank you, Bo. Representative Orcutt.
So for number one, what vehicles are initially subject to RUC? I think these are the right questions. And I just want to kind of make sure I'm clear that we're going to go through each of the 9 individually. So number 5 is how gas taxes are handled. That would be, I'm guessing that would address the question that the senator had, or the point the senator made about this being a credit. So we're just going through each of these individually, and we'll get to get to that point. I would say, though, I disagree with the senator on one point, and that's exempting out the people that are getting less than 20 miles per gallon. They're the ones that are going to get a credit. And I can tell you from a perception standpoint that if you exempt out the only people that would benefit from this and only include those who would pay more, then you are going to have people complaining that the only reason why this is being done is for the state to get more money. That's all the state ever wants, is more money. That's what I hear from my constituents. And I think you will just play right into that concern if you exempt out those people that would actually benefit from it. You will make it much, much harder to sell to a lot of people if you exempt out the 20 mile per hour or less vehicles.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that perspective. And Tom, I presume your hand is up as a remnant from your previous comment. Okay, great. I'm going to move on to question 2. Oh, Senator Fortunato, please.
Well, yeah, just to dovetail with that, has anybody ever mentioned about giving a credit?
Yes, in fact, we'll get to that on item 5 as a series of policy choices.
Because I'm all there. I'm all there.
Yours will be very small at 19.5 miles per gallon, maybe a couple bucks a year. Okay, question 2 is how is road usage reported? This gets to the sort of the meat of the operations, and we had a good conversation earlier in this meeting about the different choices. So we've sort of boiled it down to 3. The first being the self-declaration approach, self-declared odometer reading, which we tested with simulation. The second would be odometer photo reporting, which is a more perhaps trusted approach to odometer declaration, whether you do that for everybody or just as a spot check. And then the third option is to offer some form of automated reporting via, there's that word again, certified devices, apps, or in-vehicle telematics of some kind on an opt-in basis, or some combination of the above. And I think this probably, of all the topics that this committee has seen research on over the years, has probably been the deepest explored. Tried to boil it down to the literal choices that are available today, how you translate this into law and creating statute can take a number of forms, but we wanted to present it in this way for your feedback. And I think my audio is cutting, but hopefully you could hear that. Neil, I'll come to you.
Yeah, I think this is implied about what you're saying here, but I think what we've learned through this committee over the years is that there has to be customer choice. So maybe that's implied in some combination of the above, but I think it should be more clear.
Travis, your audio is cutting out. Travis, we still can't hear you.
How about now?
Yes.
Okay.
Hey.
Representative, I apologize for that. My earbuds ran out of battery and I couldn't find the right mic button. Representative Orcutt.
So periodic, you have an example of annual, but I'm guessing that could be monthly, or it could be quarterly or semi-annually. I think that has to be explored, the possibility of more frequently than annual, because somebody that gets a very high mileage vehicle and does a lot of driving is going to have a pretty big shock if they have to do it annually. So we're going to have to look at, again, comes back to what Neil was talking about, is choice to give them an opportunity. The other question will be, where and when, how are they making the payment? If it's annual, they could just do it with their vehicle registration. Or if it's periodic, then it's got to be through another process.
Right, thank you. Senator Fortunato.
Thank you. So actually, I think the first dot and the second dot are pretty similar. Okay, because how are you going to do that? I mean, that photo reporting, do you go in and maybe that's how are you going to process that? So I think one and the first one and the second one are basically combined. So I drafted a bill. It was 5574 that dealt with the paying at the road usage charge at the registration process. So the other thing that we need to do is Bo's going to need some money. I know he's just sitting there and he's just concerned about how am I going to implement this? This is going to be a major change to my computer system because, I mean, right now everybody has a record in DOL. This is my car. This is this and that. So now we need to add to that a mechanism by which payment or accumulated mileage costs can be added to that in this account. And then the way I imagine this to happen, if you have a very high mileage car, you may elect, for example, to send $25 a month into this account. So you just automatically say, I'm going to send $25 a month into this account. Then when you go to register your car, they check that account and see how much money is in there. So the subagent has to have the ability to check that account, see how much money is in there, and then apply that to the mileage when I go in. And then we also need to have car dealers do that. And then the other fly in the ointment is private vehicle sales. So we need to talk about how to handle private vehicle sales. And but all of that would be done very simply, and the biggest thing is cost effectively in the registration process. So the question comes in is, how much money is Bo going to need to create these accounts and implement with the subagents and car dealers to actually make this system work? Because I go to sell my car, we're talking about the guy that's been cheating the whole time. And then when he goes to sell the car, that's when everything comes out in the wash. So the real question is how much money is Bo going to want? And can this be implemented in that fashion?
Thank you for that. I think you've raised at least two additional questions that might be sub questions to this one. One is prepay or post-pay or choice. And the other is for private transactions of a vehicle. Does the legislature weigh in on how to handle that? If so, what's the answer? You delegate it to DOL to establish a rulemaking. Basically, do the miles, the liability for the miles travel with the vehicle to the new owner or not? That's the fundamental choice there. Have your hand up.
Thanks. So I do think, in terms of like how we present it to the legislature, Travis, I do tend to agree that like 2 is almost a form of like documenting 1. As I understand, it's still kind of the same concept. And I really do like just trying to really simplify what the choices are. So I think, to the extent maybe that, you've got sort of like the self-reporting option with some sort of, maybe documentation is in parentheses or something. But then also, as part of the discussion, really making sure the legislators understand like the costs associated with 3. I think it's very important to have it as an option. But I know what we've seen in other states is that sometimes it's a pretty high percentage of the revenue that the companies take to do those. And just so that there's like an understanding by the legislature, like, how do you want to pay for that? Like, is that something where that comes out of the receipts, or is that something that customer would have to pay to use a more sophisticated option? I just think it's an important discussion. I just say from an administrative standpoint, the first big thing is just getting the system up and running, right? With the sort of pilot pool in production. I think, you can kind of increase the compliance mechanisms over time, but just sort of getting the, those are pretty used to sort of the cadence and the nature of it will be the most important thing out the gate, right? And then if we're seeing, because, initially it's sort of almost just like a trial, right? You're just trying to see, is it functional? And then, as time goes on, it will likely, if it gets passed, become a more important revenue source. That initially it's just sort of to make sure that we can sort of pull it off, right? And that it functions well, the public understands. So those are just some questions I think we should queue up for them if we can.
Hey, Travis,
Yes, go ahead, Roy.
as the keeper of the time, we've now done 2 questions in 30 minutes. We have 7 more to go plus a survey. I just want to make sure we all understand the time period here. We're due to end at 12 o'clock. I'm not saying we can't go over, but right now it's going to be like 2 o'clock when we get done.
Thank you, Roy. I'll try to move us along and keep the comments and questions on.
We need the questions. We need the comments from everybody. Just keep that in mind as you're giving comments.
Great, thanks, Roy. Okay, third, kind of important to have a rate. What is the rate? What's it based on? And what are some rate factors or adjustments that are choices available? Again, not to pick any one of these or ones of these as the answers, but rather to put this out and ask you all, are there additional rate setting options or rate setting factors that you think are viable and worthy of at least consideration in putting this list of questions and choices to the legislature? Jane.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning, everybody. I'm Jane Wall with the County Road Administration Board. And when I was looking at your list of questions, where I don't know where this question fits in, if it's this or elsewhere, is the question around distribution of the RUC and how that will be calculated. Particularly, the County Road Board is almost entirely reliant on gas tax dollars for our preservation and grant programs. And so how will the RUC be different or the same in the motor vehicle fuel tax, and both direct distributions to cities, counties, the state, and then to grant programs like ours and those at the Transportation Improvement Board?
Yeah, thank you, Jane. I think we'll get into that on question 6. But there's a second dimension you just raised, which is not explicitly covered. So we'll be sure to add that when we get there.
Thank you so much.
The other additional choices or adjustment factors that folks would like to add on this question? Yes, Senator Fortunato.
Well, just so I believe to get the ball rolling, if it's revenue neutral, that's going to make things a lot easier to get the ball rolling. Which I think was 2.4 cents.
That's been the basis of our testing. Okay, seeing no other hands up, I'm going to move on to question 4. Caught up a little bit there. Talking about exemptions, at least in law, what are the road usage cases that are exempt from a road usage charge? We came up with 2: out-of-state and off-road or private road. And then also what would be the legal options for how to claim those exemptions. And we offer 3 categorically. Again, a standard exemption, which we think was an interesting concept that performed very well in the testing and is a way to solve for the complexity and cost of offering more precise exemptions for the vast majority of people, but you still probably want to have those as options. So whether that's manual or some form of an automated exemption. So that's how we captured the choices here. Any additional takes on exemptions that should be eligible? Yes, Senator. Oh, we can't hear you this time. There we go. Oh, no,
You're still muted.
There we go. Okay. On a previous slide, we talked about income related discounts or consideration. I don't think this is the place to do that. So all this transportation stuff isn't the place to do that. And typically from what we've heard is lower income people have higher or lower gas MPG anyway, so they're already getting that balance. So, but I don't think that this transportation stuff is the place to be messing with income. So, thank you.
Seeing no other hands raised for additional exemption concepts. This is an interesting one about gas taxes. Are credits offered for overpayment? And if so, how are they administered? And I know Bo is probably cringing in his seat at these choices, but these are theoretically choices anyway. So for credits due in excess of RUC owed, there's the choice of either offering refunds or not, and the refunds could come in the form of cash. I think to your earlier point, Representative Orcutt, maybe there are customers who appreciate refunds, but there's other ways to administer those refunds, perhaps on a more limited basis, based on income qualification or as an application toward other vehicle fees. So again, it's just an attempt to be complete in what's possible with gas tax, dealing with gas taxes already paid by customers. Representative Orcutt.
Yeah, I would just recommend that we don't even consider no refunds or no credits. If we're going to tell the people that this is a fairness issue, and everybody should pay equally for the miles they drive, then having a discussion about no refunds is inappropriate. It should be what the what kind of refund or what the process for refund would be.
Next up, Senator Fortunato.
Again, that could be handled by the same process at the registration time if they had an account, for example. They had an account, they were actually accumulating, they were reporting their miles, and they would actually be accumulating a credit, which they could then apply to their registration costs. And that would, you know, hey, you got $100 credit, $50 credit on your RUC account. Do you want to apply that to your registration process, your registration fee? And then so you just do it at the registration process. But and to Representative Orcutt's suggestion, it is a fairness issue, and that also then compensates lower income people with higher or lower MPG cars.
Thank you, Jane.
Yeah, thanks. A question that I just had, and my apologies if this has been answered back in previous years, but has there been an accounting for the gas utilized currently in the past that is not for vehicles, right? So everything from boats to ag to your lawnmower, and how that will be handled if theoretically, you know, internal combustion engines will disappear one day, we won't have a gas tax, and how those dollars or just might be how we're going to assess for that. And I know it's not really a road usage charge exactly issue, but
No, it's a fair question and point. There is an accounting done. It's actually, I think, just a statutory call out for a certain percentage of gas tax revenues to be directed to off-road vehicle account, snowmobile account, marine account, small general aviation account, to account for the fact that a small portion of gasoline taxes are being used off-road. So rather than refunding all of it, some of it is directed, a small percentage, like 1% or so, is directed to those uses.
and if I might follow up, has there then been a discussion around what happens when, you know, those revenues disappear?
Yes, yeah, the advocates for those groups have appeared before this committee, and I think some of the bills that have been proposed.
Okay, thank you.
That their accounts exist, and when the gas tax goes away, they'll need another source of funding.
Thank you.
Oh, I knew you'd have a comment on this one, Bo.
Yeah, yeah, you did call it out. I think you said cringe, which that might be a little fair. I do think so. I would certainly agree that we don't want a situation where someone is having to pay gas tax and then again pay a RUC, and you know they're sort of double paying, because that's what RUC is trying to address, right? But I do think I'll just say in our communication with the bills that have been introduced, doing like refunds or just sort of, it gets extraordinarily expensive, particularly when you have 8 million plus vehicles in the state. And so we've been very clear that that is a implementation concern. Anytime we've had to do large scale refunds, it's a very expensive, time consuming effort. And oftentimes there's the cost of sending it out. So much of that is eaten up just by the administration of it. So I will flag that is a concern for us, but we certainly don't want people double paying. I mean, that, and I think there are, you know, good mechanisms in place where we could address that.
Thank you, Bo. Okay, I'm going to move on to question 6. This is, oh, sorry, Senator Fortunato, I see your hand up.
Well, I just wanted to know what Bo thought about doing it at the registration process. Or just get a credit towards her registration.
You know, I think it's more doable. It's still, from our perspective, that's still a ginormous lift. I think what we've advocated is just, you know, like if your gas tax sort of calculation based on the nature of your vehicle and the amount of miles were to be more, then you just wouldn't, your RUC would be 0, right? You wouldn't pay any RUC. That would be our recommended way in terms of the most straightforward way to ensure fairness in that sense. But, you know, presumably the system that does RUC will be integrated with Drives, which is the system that does vehicle and driver. So something like that would theoretically be possible, but adds quite a bit of complexity in terms of the integration and the cost to administer.
Thanks, Bo. I fear we could probably spend much more than the remaining 16 minutes on this question. I want to note, Jane, your earlier comment about distributions to specific recipients of fuel taxes, which includes not only CRAB, but also cities and counties and off-road users as well. We kept this question to be more philosophical in nature and try to present the range of choices for how the revenues could be used from a road usage charge for highway preservation and maintenance, general highway purposes, or general transportation purposes. Again, not trying to use this committee as the place to decide this, but rather just to point out this is a critical feature of any bill, and this question will have to be decided.
Oh.
Yes, please go ahead, Senator.
So I drafted SJR 8200, which basically says put the ruck in the motor vehicle account. And to address the crab issue, which is, we just allocate that at the same percentage that we allocate the gas tax. So a dollar in gas tax gets allocated this way. We just got to specify that the ruck money that goes in there gets allocated the same way. So I'm expecting that this committee will make that recommendation, that we have that constitutional amendment, which is what everybody's worried about. Where's this money going? And funding roads is what everybody wants, what I want. And I don't want it used for transit or some other issues.
Thank you, Senator. Okay, privacy protection, probably the number one issue. Representative Orcutt, you alluded to this. We tried to boil this down to keep it simple for purposes of today. Number one, requiring at least one option for customers to report their road usage that does not involve any location sharing, GPS data as an option, which I believe has been a feature of pretty much all the bills that have been introduced. Going back to Neil's comment from earlier, that goes along with offering choices. And then secondly, the option of enacting the privacy provisions that are contained in the Commission's model privacy policy that was developed with oversight of this committee. And the language has been, I believe, incorporated into several of the bills over the past couple of years. So not to say the privacy issue is solved, it certainly isn't, but that I think there's been a lot of work done on it that are that present choices that are available to legislators to address it through features of law, and wanted to certainly include it in this presentation and make sure that there are not any additional choices or items that members of the committee would like to point out for consideration. Representative Orcutt.
And does that privacy policy apply also to auditing as well as the reporting?
The privacy policy applies to all data collected for purposes of calculating and administering a road usage charge, which would include any data collected for purposes of spot checking or auditing a report. Okay, seeing no other hands, question 8 is, how is the program enforced? This has not been a topic of great deal of research. There's one technical memo from the 2020 report that covers some issues related to enforcement, and we looked at it last year as part of our cost reduction workshop series, where the takeaways were to focus on voluntary compliance and encouraging and making it easy for folks to comply with the program without having to deploy enforcement. But nevertheless, if you have enforcement elements in a mandatory program, what are those elements? And there are certainly a lot of policy choices available. We offer a few here, including imposing a flat fee for those who choose not to report miles, applying a higher per mile rate or penalties for those who underreport in a self-reporting context, withholding registration renewal for non-reporting or non-payment. And finally, if there's active fraud, of course, that would perhaps merit some more stringent civil penalties. So these are all choices in a voluntary program, probably not needed. In a mandatory program, some level of enforcement tied to the vehicle registration process most likely would be warranted, but there are choices. Okay, seeing no questions, we have one more, which is sort of a catch-all. What's the long-term transition plan? Hard to boil this down to just a few bullets because it's not just about transitioning vehicles into the program, but also transitioning the way the program is administered to make sure that the costs are managed and that the customer experience is continuously addressed and improved. But focusing in on the vehicle participation aspect of transition, we have previously studied and boiled it down to transitioning by vehicle type, meaning engine type or motor fuel type, by vehicle age, that is setting a model year or years for transition, And then there's a third set of options around external triggers. So for example, New Zealand has a RUC program where diesel cars pay per mile, and electric cars were exempt from the program until such time as the adoption rate of electric vehicles reached, I believe it was 3 or 5%. That was a feature of their policy at one point in time. So there are possibilities for building sort of external triggers to move the RUC policy into other segments of the vehicle fleet over time that tie to the objectives of revenue sustainability. Any other questions or options, choices here? Okay. Well, we're up to the moment of the poll. Oh, here we go. Senator Fortunato, please.
Well, I think we already addressed that one with question 1, didn't we? 1 or 2, where we talked about exempting vehicles 20, less than 20 miles to the gallon.
Right. That would be for an initial program. So this is what do you do after that? If you don't start that in that approach, Senator, if you, for example, if you start with just electric vehicles or just vehicles of a certain age, what would be your next step after that? So the need for a transition plan certainly depends on what's the first step and what remains.
Thank you.
Thanks. Representative Orcutt.
Thank you. So file this under miscellaneous, because I'm not sure which of the 9 these would fall into. But I have 3 things that I'll just put out there really quickly. 1, cost to administer has to be part of the discussion, especially if we're looking at different ways of doing things. What are the costs? The second one is calculating the difference between the gas tax and the RUC. Is that going to be done by actual fuel economy, or is it going to be done by EPA rating? I can tell you it does make a difference because when I did the pilot originally, I did the first part of the pilot on odometer reading, and I got a credit showing. When I went to the non-GPS electronic, suddenly I was having to pay. So there was a difference there somehow. And then there's the goal of reducing vehicle miles traveled by, I think, 2035. What is the impact of that? Are we going to keep the rate the same, or is there going to be some increase in what the RUC rate is going to be to cover the revenues that would decline by a declining miles traveled?
Thank you very much. Good questions. Jan.
Yeah, so I just had a quick question, and this probably also could go under that miscellaneous, is if there needs to be any conversation about local option taxes. So so that's just a question. It hasn't come up in our conversations. We haven't gotten quite this far into the process before, but that would be something that we may want to at least have considered.
Thank you for that. Good point. Little known fact, there are local option gas taxes in Washington. No one has opted into it, as far as I know. Is there a need for adding that question, probably to the rate question? But thank you for that. Okay, we have 6 minutes. General open call for additional questions. Thank you all for your feedback and contributions. I really appreciate this discussion. Our team will be reviewing the tape and collecting the notes and working it into the roadmap, which is our last deliverable for this Forward Drive project. While you're thinking about if you have any additional questions, I believe Irie has a poll queued up. This will be a test not only of your attention span, but also your technical prowess, because we're using Zoom for it. You should see a pop-up screen. If you're working on an iPad or a mobile phone, I don't know what it looks like, so I'll apologize in advance. But there are these 8 questions, and the exercise is to answer for each of the 8 questions. How does it rank for you, most important to least important? So you'll see, for example, what vehicles are subject to RUC. You can answer 1 through 8. We'd like to ask you to select each answer only once. So don't answer they're all most important, but rather try to rank order them 1 through 8. That will just give us a high level sense of where the most important questions to address lie. This first poll that you're seeing right now is what are the most important questions for initial enactment of a RUC program? So thinking about not 10 or 20 or 30 years from now, but the initial enactment of a RUC program, probably a small scale program. What are the most important questions to get right for that initial enactment? And I will pause and give folks a few minutes to work through because it involves about 16 clicks to answer each of your questions and hopefully some good thinking too. And project team, please do not answer. This is for members of the committee.
And if you expand it out, you'd be able to see all the questions.
Irie, are you able to see the number of answers completed?
Looks like 14. We just had one more.
We'll give 1 more minute before you close that one and launch the next one. Okay, why don't we close that poll? Is anyone still working on it? Need an additional second? Sharon, we can come to you through email. I suspect this is an impossible exercise on an iPad. If that's easier for you.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and end it then.
Okay, great. Thank you. And now we'll launch the second poll. Same questions. Now we're answering for a long-term future transition. What are the most important and least important, ranked from 1 to 8 of those 8 questions? Looking to the future, what is it most important to get right in the long term as opposed to initial enactment? And maybe you answer it the same way, but we thought we would ask it both ways just to see if there are some interesting differences. And we will carry this poll right up until 2 o'clock. And then Roy, I will hand it to you to close us out. And Sharon, we will send you the questions over email if you want to just type us 8 numbers in sequence. Okay, great. Okay, Roy, I'll hand it back to you if you want to close this out, and Irie, you can leave the poll open until a minute or 2 past 2 p.m. Oh, sorry, Representative Phi, if you'd like to come say a word of closing, please.
Yeah, thanks, Travis. I just wanted to thank people for spending the time on this. I believe it's helpful in terms of how we spend our time and in going through the moving this forward and what issues are the most important. And I look forward to the follow-up that we have to have some discussion about each one of these issues with you, and hope that you can participate in that.
So before I close out the meeting and everything, do we have the results of the poll?
I believe we do. I don't know if we can display them at the same time as it's open. Maybe Irie, if you want to close the second poll now and you can display one or both results. I'll apologize in advance. This is the first time we've used a Zoom poll. The results are going to be terribly difficult to understand. So we will do some post-processing and try to convey them in an easier to read format after the meeting.
Okay, I'll go ahead and close it out.
So these are the results for the second question on what's most important for the future. It's difficult to interpret because they use colors that are not necessarily coordinated to correspond to numbers at the bottom. So you kind of have to visually map. But if you hover over each individual answer, you can see a pop-up that gives you a sense of how many folks answered for each question. But again, we'll do some post-processing to make this a little easier to interpret.
Good. Any questions on the poll? Other than we're going to get something in to tell us what it actually was. And we can understand it. All right, I'd like to thank everybody for being here today. I hope Chair Fry got what he needs. I'll say it again. I term out in 25, and I would like to have this done before I term out, being that I've been on this the whole time I've been on the commission. I look forward to the final draft report to be reviewed, and remember to send it back within a week. And unless anybody has anything else, this meeting is adjourned. Thanks, everyone.